Okay, now we're moving into the very end of the Cold War and how the Soviet Union collapsed. So the Soviet Union had a bunch of internal problems going on in the 80s and early 90s. They have increasing Soviet military expenses in order to compete with the US. Remember, um, massive retaliation and the idea that we had to match each other. We have rising nationalism in the Soviet republics. We have fast paced reforms known as a market economy. We have economic inefficiency and Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika, which was openness and economic restructuring. So they're moving away from this communist idea because it's inefficient, and they're moving towards the openness and economic restructuring. The nationalism in the Soviet republics, they are the countries that were taken over by the Soviet Union after the end of World War II, and they were made Soviet republics, but now they're starting to see, hey, we want to have our own national pride, not belong to this big, great union. We want to support ourselves. So these are a lot of fractures going on in the Soviet Union, again, in the 80s and 90s. President Reagan was president during the 80s for us. He challenged the moral legitimacy of the Soviet Union. You can see in the picture on the right, he's standing in front of the Berlin Wall. And in a speech at the Berlin Wall, he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He was very passionate about tearing down the wall and getting rid of this real and imaginary border between the East and the West. He increased U.S. military and economic pressure on the Soviet Union to help push to get the Soviet Union to break down. In the election of 1980, you can see how wildly popular Reagan was and how he very quickly beat President Carter. And it shows you how dissatisfied the Americans were with President Carter during his tenure. So Reagan's the 40th president. His campaign pledge was to restore the great confident roar of American progress and growth and optimism. He got the American hostages that were held in Iran freed the same day he got inaugurated. They had been held hostage for 444 days under President Carter. There was an assassination attempt where he was shot only 69 days after he took office. He recovered very quickly, though, and returned to duty. His grace and wit during the event actually increased his popularity. He was very well liked. Part of that coming from the fact that he had a prior career in being an actor, so he was very charismatic and easy to like. The Reagan Revolution, that aimed to reinvigorate the American people and reduce their reliance upon the government. He wanted to cut taxes. He transferred responsibilities from federal governments to state governments. He appointed Supreme Court justices who exercised judicial restraint, which means they erred on the side of caution and chose not to rule very liberally and make grand sweeping decisions. He filled 3 Supreme Court seats, and he appointed half of the judges in the federal system. Reagan and Bush both appointed conservative judges. He had a reduction in the number and the scope of government programs and regulations. And he believed in peace through strength, where he strengthened America's military by increasing defense spending by 35% And he also brought about the end of the Cold War with the Star Wars plan, which was constantly increasing how much we're spending on the defense budget and what new technologies can we participate in? Where do we want to go next out of this world? What can we do? So after Reagan, you have George Herbert Walker Bush, who was his vice president, become president. Then you have Bill Clinton, who was a moderate Democrat. Then you have a Republican sweep of the congressional elections in the 1990s. And then you have George W. Bush become president as well. So you have a large conservative movement going on in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s as a result of the Reagan Revolution. After the Cold War, our goals and policies included foreign aid, helping money, humanitarian aid, helping other people, and supporting human rights throughout the world. So George Herbert Walker Bush was president from 1989 to 1993. He was president for the official fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the reunification of Germany when the Berlin Wall came down. Those are the pictures you see on the bottom. Again, collapse of the Berlin Wall, as well as the breakup of the Soviet Union. So you have the NATO and Warsaw Pact at the beginning of Bush's tenure, and then afterwards, you just simply have NATO. Which still exists today. The first Iraq War was under the first Bush, or the first Gulf War. It's the first war where American women were able to serve in a combat role. First, we have Operation Desert Storm, which was a coalition of 34 nations against Iraq to remove the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Iraq invaded Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. The UN imposed sanctions, so people, the Iraqi government was told they had to do certain things by certain points, but ultimately the deadline passed. Aerial bombardment on January 17th, 1991. There was a ground assault on February 23rd, 1991, and ultimately Iraq was moved from Kuwait. In Operation Desert Shield, Iraq posed a threat to Saudi Arabia. If Iraq gained control of Saudi oil fields, Saddam Hussein would have control over the majority of the world's oil fields. Does any of this sound vaguely familiar in regards to World War II and Hitler wanting to gain control of oil fields? If you have oil fields, you have power. Operation Desert Shield was a wholly defense mission to prevent Iraq from invading Saudi Arabia. So you can see in this map, the purple is Iraq and occupied territory, and then the green is our coalition members. So you can see the major airstrikes and also the major missile targets throughout the Saudi Arabian, Kuwait, and Iraqi area. And again, all of it had to do with control of oil fields and who would control those oil fields. Here you have President Bush in Iraq. Bill Clinton was president from 1993 to 2001. He formed an economic alliance known as NAFTA, or North American Free Trade Agreement, which is the United States, Mexico, and Canada. He also supported full diplomatic relations with Vietnam for the first time since the Vietnam War. He lifted the economic sanctions against South Africa. So they had economic sanctions because of apartheid, and that was government enforced segregation, basically, and the mistreatment of blacks in South Africa. And the government finally ended that policy, so the U.S. was able to lift the economic sanctions against them and were able to communicate and trade with them again. There was also NATO action in former Yugoslavia, where the NATO mission was launched to punish Milosevic and his armed forces for the continued attacks on ethnic Albanians in the Serbian province of Kosovo. So you can see on the map here on the right, that is part of Eastern Europe. And as we talked about before with the Soviet Union and the collapse of it, you've got those nations that wanted to support their own nationalism. Well, within those areas, you have a bunch of different ethnic groups. It's not just one broad ethnic group for Eastern Europe. You have your Serbs, you have your Croats, you've got so many different ones, Albanians. So Milosevic was absolutely attacking Albanians in Kosovo, and NATO said this is not right. You should not be doing this. So, so there was a NATO mission to punish him and the armed forces that were taking part in that. George W. Bush, 2001 to 2009. He was president during the terrorist attacks on U.S. soil of 9/11, 2001. He was also president for the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq.